the story of American crime, there are names that echo through history like dark legends, whispered with both fear and fascination. Among them, one name towers above the rest: Alphonse Gabriel Capone, the man the world came to know simply as Al Capone, or Scarface. To some, he was a ruthless gangster, a murderer who bathed the streets of Chicago in blood. To others, he was a folk hero, a man who outsmarted the system, handed out food during the Great Depression, and gave the people what they wanted when the government tried to take it away. Between those two extremes lies the true story, one rooted in ambition, violence, corruption, and the fragile line between order and chaos. Capone's rise cannot be separated from the times in which he lived. At the dawn of the 20th century, America was changing rapidly. Waves of immigrants were flooding into cities like New York and Chicago, chasing the dream of a better life, but often finding only overcrowded tenements, dangerous jobs, and bitter discrimination. Out of that struggle emerged new networks of survival: gangs, neighborhood crews, and organized crime groups that offered protection, money, and power in exchange for loyalty. In that world, men like Capone found not only survival but opportunity. The stage for Capone's empire was set by one of the boldest social experiments in American history: Prohibition. In 1920, the 18th Amendment outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Lawmakers believed they were striking a blow for morality, hoping to end drunkenness, crime, and family breakdown. But what they unleashed instead was a nationwide appetite for the forbidden. Americans did not stop drinking, they simply went underground. Speakeasies bloomed in every city, bootleggers moved liquor across state lines, and fortunes were waiting to be made by those ruthless and clever enough to supply the demand. It was into this volatile atmosphere that Al Capone stepped. He had not invented crime, nor was he the only gangster exploiting prohibition. But he would become its most notorious symbol. The face of the bootlegging empire, the man who embodied both the glamour and the horror of the era. His Chicago operation was not simply a gang. It was a machine, one that pulled in tens of millions of dollars a year. His network reached from the hidden breweries to the speakeasies on every corner, protected by police officers, judges, and politicians who were only too happy to take bribes. Violence was not an accident of his business. It was its engine. Guns, bombs, and beatings were the tools by which Capone built his power and eliminated his rivals. Yet for all the bloodshed, Capone cultivated a strange kind of public image. He was not content to remain a shadowy figure in the underworld. He posed for photographs, gave interviews, and even presented himself as a businessman and philanthropist. Newspapers devoured his every move, portraying him as both villain and celebrity. Crowds cheered him when he appeared in public, and struggling families remembered the food drives he sponsored during the Depression. To some, Capone was proof that the system was corrupt and hypocritical, that a man from the streets could rise higher than the politicians who pretended to serve the people. But beneath the charisma was a brutal reality. Capone's empire was stained with blood, his fortune built on intimidation, extortion, and death. Rival gangs, like the North Side mob led by Bugs Moran, paid dearly for crossing him. The most infamous example came on a cold morning in February 1929, when 7 men were lined up against a garage wall and cut down in a hail of machine gun fire. The 18th Valentine's Day Massacre shocked the nation and cemented Capone's reputation as the most dangerous gangster in America. For a time, it seemed he was untouchable. Local police were in his pocket. City officials looked the other way. Even the people who despised him admitted that Capone controlled Chicago like no other man. But his downfall would come not from the gun, but from the ledger. The federal government, led by men like Eliot Ness and the so-called untouchables, turned to an unexpected weapon, the income tax. If prosecutors could not convict Capone for murder or bootlegging, they would bring him down for failing to pay taxes on his massive illegal income. It was a strategy as brilliant as it was ironic. The king of crime undone by paperwork. Capone's trial in 1931 was one of the most sensational of the era. For the first time, the gangster who had walked above the law faced real consequences. Found guilty of tax evasion, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, a crushing blow to his empire. Incarcerated first in Atlanta and later transferred to the infamous Alcatraz, Capone's aura of invincibility began to crumble. Behind bars, stripped of his power, he was just another inmate, though even there his notoriety set him apart. But prison was not the only enemy that claimed him. Years of untreated syphilis began to ravage his mind and body. Once feared and admired as the ruler of Chicago, Capone spent his final years a broken man, confused and weakened, living out his days in isolation at his Florida estate. When he died in 1947, at the age of 48, the world reflected on the rise and fall of Scarface with a mixture of fascination and relief. The legend of Al Capone has only grown since his death. He has been immortalized in books, films, and television shows, often portrayed as the archetype of the gangster, a man both larger than life and deeply human in his flaws. But beyond the myths, his story remains a cautionary tale. It is a reminder of how laws can create black markets, how corruption can rot the foundations of society, and how power built on fear is ultimately doomed to collapse. This is the story we are about to explore in depth. The journey of a boy from Brooklyn who became the most feared man in Chicago. The empire he built with blood and ambition, the massacre that shocked the nation, and the slow, inevitable unraveling of his reign. Over the next chapters, we will walk step by step through the life of Al Capone, his roots, his rise, his crimes, and his fall. Because to understand Capone is to understand not only the man himself, but the America that allowed him to thrive, the America of prohibition, corruption, and dreams both broken and fulfilled in the shadows of the underworld. This is not just the biography of one criminal. It is the portrait of an era painted in smoke, whiskey, and gunfire. And it all begins here with the making of a legend called Scarface. Alphonse Gabriel Capone's story begins in the crowded streets of Brooklyn, New York, where life for an immigrant family at the turn of the 20th century was anything but easy. He was born on January 17, 1899, the fourth of 9 children to Gabriel and Teresa Capone, a hardworking Italian couple who had left their hometown of Angri, near Naples, in search of a better future in America. Like so many immigrants, they carried with them little more than hope, determination, and the willingness to labor endlessly in order to give their children a chance at success. Gabriel Capone worked as a barber, cutting hair for a modest wage, while Teresa took in sewing and worked as a homemaker. The Capone household was crowded, noisy, and filled with the struggles common to immigrant families. Language barriers, long hours of work, and the harsh realities of poverty. Brooklyn at the time was a patchwork of immigrant neighborhoods where Italians, Irish, Jews, and other communities lived side by side, often in uneasy coexistence. Prejudice against Italians was rampant, and opportunities for advancement were few. For young Al Capone, this was the world that shaped his earliest experiences, a life where survival depended as much on toughness and connections as on hard work. As a child, Capone was not unlike other boys in the neighborhood. He played stickball in the streets, got into scuffles, and attended school in the local parish system. But academics never came easily to him. He left school at the age of 14 after striking a teacher who had disciplined him, a moment that symbolized both his volatile temper and his unwillingness to bow to authority. From that day on, Capone's classroom would no longer be made of desks and chalkboards. It would be the alleys, the pool halls, and the corners where street gangs thrived. The streets of Brooklyn in the early 1900s were a training ground for young men like Capone. Gangs offered not just camaraderie, but also power, identity, and protection in a city where police often turned a blind eye to neighborhood disputes. Capone gravitated toward groups like the South Brooklyn Rippers and the 40 Thieves Juniors, local outfits that specialized in petty theft, brawling, and low-level rackets. These gangs were more than just rowdy bands of kids. They were the first rung on a ladder that led directly into organized crime. It wasn't long before Capone came under the influence of older and more seasoned criminals. He admired men who carried themselves with swagger and commanded respect through both fear and charm. He also began to learn the unwritten rules of the street. Loyalty mattered, reputation was everything, and violence was sometimes the only language people understood. It was during these formative years that Capone first began to show the qualities that would later define him: an ability to lead, a willingness to use force, and a sharp instinct for opportunity. One of the most significant turning points in his early life came when he found work at the Harvard Inn, a Coney Island dance hall and saloon owned by gangster Frankie Yale. Yale was a powerful figure in Brooklyn's underworld, and the Harvard Inn was a hot spot for gamblers, toughs, and men looking to make deals in the shadows. Capone began working there as a bouncer and bartender, and it was in this role that he earned the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. One night, Capone made an unwise remark to a woman in the bar, insulting her appearance. Her brother, angered, retaliated by slashing Capone across the face with a knife, leaving 3 deep scars that stretched from his left ear to his mouth. From that moment on, he became known as Scarface. Capone himself despised the nickname, often trying to hide his scars by turning his face in photographs. He preferred to tell people the marks were from war wounds, a story he believed gave him more dignity. But the moniker stuck, and the world would forever associate him with that violent encounter. Despite the humiliation, Capone's time at the Harvard Inn proved invaluable. Working for Frankie Yale introduced him to a higher level of criminal operation. He observed how Yale ran his rackets, how he balanced intimidation with diplomacy, and how money flowed through gambling, prostitution, and liquor. Capone absorbed these lessons quickly. More importantly, Yale became a mentor, opening doors that would eventually lead Capone out of Brooklyn and into the city where his destiny awaited: Chicago. But before that move, Capone's personal life took a significant turn. At the age of 19, he married May Coughlin, an Irish Catholic woman from Brooklyn. The marriage was unusual for its time, given the cultural divisions between Italians and Irish, but it provided Capone with stability. Together they had a son, Albert Francis Capone, nicknamed Sonny, born just before the wedding in 1918. For all his brutality in the streets, Capone was known to be a devoted father, and he remained protective of his family throughout his life. The birth of his son and his marriage coincided with a shift in Capone's ambitions. He had outgrown the street-level rackets of Brooklyn. Through Frankie Yale's connections, he was introduced to Johnny Torrio, a seasoned gangster with far bigger visions. Torrio was based in Chicago, where he was helping his uncle Big Jim Colosimo run a sprawling criminal empire built on gambling, brothels, and, soon, bootlegging. Torrio recognized potential in Capone, a mix of muscle, loyalty, and intelligence that could be harnessed for greater profit. By 1919, Capone had made the move to Chicago, leaving behind the tenements of Brooklyn for the bustling, corrupt, and wide-open city that would become his empire. Chicago in the early 1920s was ripe for someone like Capone. It was a city divided by ethnic lines, riddled with political corruption, and about to be transformed by Prohibition into the most lucrative criminal marketplace in the nation. The boy who had once roamed the streets of Brooklyn, a dropout with scars on his face and a chip on his shoulder, was now stepping onto a much larger stage. Under Torrio's guidance, he would hone his skills not just as an enforcer, but as a strategist. He would learn to balance terror with charm, generosity with intimidation, and in the process, he would rise far beyond the gangs of his youth. From his humble beginnings in a struggling immigrant household to his first encounters with the underworld, Capone's early life set the foundation for everything that followed. Brooklyn gave him toughness, Frankie Yale gave him opportunity, and Johnny Torrio gave him direction. With those tools, Capone was ready to transform himself from a neighborhood thug into the architect of Chicago's criminal empire. The story of Al Capone's rise was just beginning. The streets of Brooklyn had given birth to a gangster, but it was Chicago that would make him a legend. When Al Capone arrived in Chicago in 1919, he was still young, barely 20 years old, but already carrying the reputation of a man who knew how to survive the streets. What he lacked in polish, he made up for in toughness and ambition. Yet, for all his swagger and scars, Capone was not yet the figure who would dominate headlines and terrify rivals. He needed a teacher, someone who could refine his raw instincts and shape him into more than just a thug with muscle. That teacher was Johnny Torrio. Torrio, a fellow Brooklyn native, had already carved out a reputation as one of the most intelligent and disciplined crime leaders of his time. Unlike the brash street brawlers who often rose and fell in the underworld, Torrio was methodical. He believed that crime could be managed like a business, organized, efficient, and as free from unnecessary risk as possible. Where others relied solely on intimidation, Torrio preferred negotiation first and violence only when absolutely necessary. He was known for his sharp mind, his calm demeanor, and his ability to make allies rather than enemies. To Capone, he was more than a boss. He was a role model. At the time of Capone's arrival, Torrio was serving under his uncle by marriage, James "Big Jim" Colosimo. Colosimo controlled a profitable empire of gambling dens and brothels in Chicago, and Torrio acted as his trusted lieutenant. The business was lucrative, but in 1920, everything changed. Prohibition came into effect, and the demand for alcohol exploded overnight. Where Colosimo saw only risk and danger in entering the bootlegging trade, Torrio saw opportunity. The profits from liquor, he realized, could dwarf those from gambling and prostitution. But Colosimo was stubborn. He was satisfied with what he already had and refused to expand into the new business. Torrio, ambitious and forward-thinking, decided that Colosimo was standing in the way. The old boss had become a liability. In May of 1920, Colosimo was lured to his cafe under the pretense of meeting new suppliers. Instead, he was ambushed and shot dead. The murder was never officially solved, but most historians agree that Torrio orchestrated the hit to clear his path. Some even suggest that Al Capone, then still proving his loyalty, was one of the men involved, though the evidence is circumstantial. Regardless of who pulled the trigger, Colosimo's death opened the door for Torrio to take control of Chicago's underworld. With Torrio now in charge, Capone's role grew rapidly. At first, he handled smaller tasks, collecting payments, protecting shipments, and serving as muscle when negotiations turned violent. But Torrio quickly saw more in his young protege. Capone was not just a bruiser. He was sharp, observant, and capable of managing operations. Torrio gave him greater responsibility, and soon Capone was overseeing sections of the bootlegging empire, coordinating deliveries, and making sure that rival gangs and corrupt officials alike stayed in line. Chicago in the early 1920s was a city ready to be exploited. The demand for alcohol was insatiable, and the police and politicians were all too willing to accept bribes in exchange for looking the other way. Torrio and Capone established breweries and distilleries, setting up a vast network that supplied speakeasies across the city. Trucks carried beer and whiskey through the streets, often under the protection of bribed officers. The money poured in by the millions, and with it came influence. Judges were bought, aldermen were bribed, and even high-ranking officials owed favors to the syndicate. But with success came danger. Chicago was not a city where one gang could monopolize everything without challenge. Rival groups, particularly the North Side Gang led by Dion O'Banion, contested Torrio's control. At first, Torrio attempted diplomacy. He believed that violence was bad for business, drawing unwanted attention from law enforcement and the press. But Capone, though he respected Torrio's restraint, was quicker to embrace intimidation. To Capone, fear was often the most efficient tool of all. Their partnership balanced these two approaches. Torrio's diplomacy kept the empire stable, while Capone's ruthlessness ensured it stayed secure. Capone also began to step into the spotlight during these years. He became known not just as Torrio's enforcer, but as a figure in his own right. Reporters noticed him, describing the scarred young gangster with sharp suits and a confident smile. He moved his family to a comfortable home in Cicero, a suburb of Chicago, where he began to establish a base of operations outside the direct reach of city officials. Cicero became Capone's fortress, a place where he controlled not only the bootlegging operations, but also the local elections. Intimidation squads ensured that candidates friendly to Torrio and Capone held office, further tightening their grip on power. In 1924, this control was tested during the Cicero municipal elections. Capone's men were deployed to ensure victory, but the day descended into chaos. Gangsters roamed the streets, intimidating voters and attacking opponents. Police officers who resisted were beaten, and polling stations were flooded with Capone loyalists. It was a brutal but effective display of force, one that demonstrated how far Capone had come since his days in Brooklyn gangs. He was no longer simply Torrio's apprentice. He was becoming a power in his own right. That same year, however, violence began to spiral out of Torrio's control. The North Side Gang struck back, assassinating O'Banion, but igniting a series of reprisals. Torrio himself was ambushed outside his home in 1925, shot multiple times but miraculously surviving. The attack shook him deeply. Unlike Capone, who thrived on the adrenaline of power, Torrio had always preferred to avoid the limelight. The assassination attempt convinced him that it was time to retire. Recovering from his wounds, Torrio made a decision that would change Capone's life forever. He handed the empire to his protege. In January 1925, Johnny Torrio stepped aside, retreating to a quiet life in Brooklyn. Al Capone, only 26 years old, suddenly found himself at the head of Chicago's most powerful criminal syndicate. Torrio's lessons, the value of negotiation, the importance of organization, the art of bribery, had prepared him for this moment. But Capone would rule differently. Where Torrio sought balance, Capone pursued dominance. Where Torrio preferred subtlety, Capone embraced the spotlight. and where Torrio avoided unnecessary violence, Capone made it a weapon of fear and reputation. The apprenticeship was over. Al Capone was now the boss. Johnny Torrio may have faded into the background, living a quiet life until his death decades later. But his influence on Capone cannot be overstated. Torrio had taken a street tough from Brooklyn and shown him how to think like a businessman. He had opened doors, provided protection, and instilled a philosophy of organization that would shape Capone's empire. Without Torrio, there may never have been Scarface as history remembers him. Yet, as Capone assumed full control, the era of restraint was ending. Chicago was about to enter its bloodiest chapter, and the young gangster with the scarred face was ready to write it in bullets and bootleg whiskey. The year was 1920, and America had embarked on one of the most ambitious social experiments in its history. The 18th Amendment had outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages across the nation. What lawmakers believed would purify society, reduce crime, and strengthen families instead created an underground economy more lucrative than anything the underworld had ever seen. While millions of ordinary Americans still wanted to drink, the legitimate supply had vanished overnight. That vacuum was filled by men willing to defy the law, bootleggers, gangsters, and entrepreneurs of vice. Among them, no one exploited the opportunity more completely than Al Capone. When Johnny Torrio handed the reins of his empire to Capone in 1925, he also handed him control over one of the most sophisticated bootlegging operations in the country. Capone immediately recognized that alcohol was not just a product, it was the foundation of an empire. Whiskey, beer, and gin were not luxuries. They were daily desires for a population that had no intention of giving them up. By supplying that demand, Capone would transform himself from a rising gangster into the king of Chicago. Capone's organization began by securing breweries and distilleries throughout Chicago and its suburbs. Hidden in warehouses, back rooms, and industrial plants, these facilities churned out alcohol at a staggering rate. Trucks carried the shipments through the city, often disguised as deliveries of milk, bread, or meat. The logistics were immense, requiring coordination between drivers, guards, distributors, and the owners of speakeasies. But Capone's genius lay in turning this sprawling enterprise into something resembling a corporation. Every step of the process was controlled, every dollar accounted for, and every potential obstacle neutralized with either bribes or bullets. The profits were extraordinary. By the mid-1920s, Capone's bootlegging operations were bringing in an estimated $60 to $100 million a year, a fortune by the standards of the time. Adjusted for inflation, that would equal over $1 billion today. With so much money flowing, Capone could afford to buy loyalty on every level. Police officers received envelopes stuffed with cash to look the other way. Judges were paid to dismiss cases or grant lenient sentences. Politicians, from aldermen to city officials, lined their pockets with Capone's bribes. In Chicago, the line between government and gangster blurred until, in many cases, it vanished altogether. But Capone was more than just a businessman. He understood the psychology of both his customers and his rivals. To the public, he wanted to appear as a provider, not merely a criminal. He ensured that his speakeasies were well stocked, his liquor was reliable, and his prices competitive. For many Chicagoans, especially working-class citizens, Capone was not the villain painted by the press, but the man who made sure their weekends were lively and their glasses were full. He even gained a reputation for generosity, funding soup kitchens and handing out food during the Great Depression, gestures that softened his image and built public sympathy. Behind the charm, However, violence was always waiting. Bootlegging was not a monopoly, and competition for territory was fierce. Rival gangs sought to control neighborhoods, speakeasies, and distribution routes. Capone's answer was simple: dominate or destroy. His men, armed with pistols, shotguns, and the notorious Thompson submachine gun, enforced his rule with ruthless efficiency. Trucks that belonged to rivals were hijacked. Breweries were bombed. Gangsters who defied Capone often ended up dead in alleyways, their bodies serving as messages to anyone else considering resistance. One of Capone's most significant battles during this period was with the North Side Gang, first led by Dean O'Banion and later by Hemi Wace and George Bugs Moran. The North Siders controlled their own share of the bootlegging market and resented Capone's expansion into their territory. What began as business disagreements quickly escalated into a violent gang war that would claim dozens of lives over the next decade. Chicago became a battlefield, with gunfire erupting in broad daylight and explosions tearing through the night. The newspapers called it the Beer Wars, and the city lived in constant fear. Yet for all the violence, Capone managed to maintain a peculiar kind of celebrity status. Reporters followed his movements, photographing him in tailored suits and fedoras, describing his expensive cars, his diamond jewelry, and his flamboyant lifestyle. He dined at the best restaurants, sat in the finest theater boxes, and entertained politicians and celebrities alike. In an era when many Americans were disillusioned with corrupt officials and failed policies, Capone seemed to embody both rebellion and success. He was the outlaw who played by his own rules and lived a life most could only dream of. Still, not everyone was charmed. Reformers, religious leaders, and federal officials decried Capone's empire as a cancer on society. Preachers railed against the lawlessness that Prohibition had unleashed. Journalists wrote scathing editorials demanding action. Ordinary citizens, too, grew weary of the constant gun battles and the sense that Chicago had become a city held hostage by gangsters. The pressure on law enforcement mounted, and slowly but surely, the federal government began to take notice. But in the mid-1920s, Capone appeared untouchable. He had bought protection at nearly every level. Cases against him collapsed for lack of evidence or vanished witnesses. Police raids on his breweries often ended in mysterious tip-offs that allowed his men to escape. Even when Capone himself was arrested, he was usually released within hours. He famously quipped, "They can't collect legal taxes from illegal money," a line that captured his arrogance, but would later come back to haunt him. What truly set Capone apart during this era was his ability to blend brutality with showmanship. He ruled with fear, but he also understood the value of publicity. He granted interviews, smiling for reporters and offering witty sound bites that made him seem less like a monster and more like a rogue. His scarred face and flashy demeanor became iconic, cementing his identity as the nation's most famous gangster. The combination of charm, fear, and wealth allowed him to expand his reach beyond Chicago, influencing rackets in other cities and even establishing connections with organized crime figures in New York. By the late 1920s, Capone's power had reached its peak. His empire stretched across Chicago, employing thousands of men, controlling hundreds of speakeasies, and dominating the liquor trade. He was only in his late 20s, yet he wielded more power than most politicians in the state of Illinois. To his supporters, he was the king of Chicago. To his enemies, he was a ruthless tyrant. To the federal government, he was becoming a problem that could no longer be ignored. The bootlegging business had given Capone everything: wealth, fame, influence, and control. But it had also sown the seeds of his downfall. The violence it inspired would culminate in one of the most infamous massacres in American history. The attention it drew from law enforcement would eventually pierce the shield of bribery and intimidation. For now, though, in the roaring heart of the Prohibition era, Capone stood at the height of his power, a man who had turned America's great moral crusade into his personal goldmine. By the mid-1920s, Al Capone's bootlegging empire had grown into a sprawling operation that touched nearly every corner of Chicago. Beer, whiskey, and gin flowed freely despite the 18th Amendment, and Capone's network of breweries and distilleries was running at full capacity. But liquor alone did not define his empire. To sustain and expand his power, Capone needed a system, a machine that combined speakeasies, political influence, and community control. He built it with ruthless precision, and in the process, he became not just a gangster but the shadow mayor of Chicago. Speakeasies were at the heart of Capone's expansion. These hidden bars, tucked away in basements, back rooms, and behind unmarked doors, were where Chicagoans came to escape the restrictions of Prohibition. By the late 1920s, there were thousands of speakeasies across the city, and a staggering portion of them were supplied directly by Capone's syndicate. The establishments ranged from dinghy dives serving bathtub gin to glamorous nightclubs with jazz bands and showgirls. In each case, Capone's control over the liquor ensured that money poured steadily into his coffers. Running this vast network required more than trucks and breweries. It required protection. Every speakeasy was a potential target for raids, rival gangs, or extortionists. Capone's organization provided insurance in the form of muscle. His men collected payments, enforced rules, and ensured that anyone attempting to muscle in on Capone's territory quickly regretted it. Violence was not random, it was systematic, designed to remind everyone who truly ran the city. But force alone was not enough to keep the empire safe. Bribery was just as important as bullets. Capone understood that the key to lasting power was not to fight against the system, but to own it. He spent millions each year on payoffs to police officers, judges, aldermen, and even state's attorneys. Envelopes stuffed with cash changed hands in smoky back rooms. And with those bribes came a web of protection that reached from the streets to the highest levels of city government. Arrests were dismissed, raids were tipped off in advance, and court cases simply evaporated. Chicago's institutions, meant to uphold the law, had been quietly repurposed into tools of Capone's empire. The political corruption extended beyond payoffs. Capone realized that true control required influence over elections themselves. Cicero, the suburb where he had settled, became his personal stronghold. In 1924, during municipal elections, Capone's men flooded polling stations, intimidating voters, beating opponents, and stuffing ballot boxes. The violence was so blatant that it shocked even hardened Chicagoans, but it worked. Capone's candidates won, ensuring that Cicero's government would remain friendly to his operations. Cicero became Capone's fortress, a base from which he could expand his reach across the city. Within this environment of speakeasies and political control, Capone cultivated his public image. He wanted to be seen not only as a gangster, but as a man of the people. Stories circulated of Capone handing out turkeys on Thanksgiving or paying rent for struggling families. During the worst days of the Great Depression, he even opened a soup kitchen that fed thousands of unemployed men, women, and children. Whether these acts were genuine gestures of goodwill or carefully calculated propaganda, they served their purpose. To many ordinary Chicagoans, Capone was not the villain portrayed in newspapers, but a provider who did what the government could not. At the same time, Capone knew how to charm the press. He granted interviews, offering witty remarks and colorful sound bites. He was photographed in tailored suits, smoking expensive cigars and riding in luxury cars. Reporters described his lifestyle in vivid detail, from his diamond-studded jewelry to his nights spent in the city's most exclusive clubs. Capone understood that in an age of sensational headlines, image was power. If the public saw him as larger than life, then the law would have a harder time bringing him down. Yet for all his charm, the reality of Capone's empire was one of intimidation and brutality. Those who crossed him paid dearly. Speakeasy owners who refused to buy from his syndicate found themselves beaten, their businesses destroyed, or worse. Rival gangs that tried to encroach on his territory were met with bombs and bullets. Even allies knew that loyalty was non-negotiable. Betrayal was punished with death. The combination of fear and favor created a system where few dared to oppose him openly. It was during this period that Capone's organization developed what became known as the ham and eggs system. The phrase referred to the widespread bribery and graft that greased the wheels of Chicago politics. Aldermen, police officers, and even local ward bosses received regular payoffs from Capone's men, ensuring that City Hall ran not on principle, but on patronage. The phrase, ham and eggs, captured the everyday nature of the corruption. It was as routine as breakfast, part of the city's daily diet. Everyone had their price, and Capone was willing to pay it. This web of speakeasies, bribes, and political influence transformed Capone's organization into something unprecedented in American history. It was not simply a gang. It was an empire that functioned like a shadow government. Money flowed in, protection was bought, and decisions were enforced with both cash and violence. Chicago's official leaders may have held titles, but in reality, it was Capone who held the power. The expansion of his empire also fueled his own personal extravagance. Capone lived lavishly, moving into a luxurious suite at the Lexington Hotel, which became both his headquarters and his fortress. He surrounded himself with bodyguards, traveled in armored cars, and threw parties that rivaled those of Hollywood stars. He was a young man, still in his late 20s, but he commanded the kind of wealth and influence that most politicians could only dream of. To his associates, he was both boss and benefactor. To his enemies, he was a nightmare. To the public, he was a paradox, both feared gangster and admired celebrity. But beneath the glitter and glamour, the foundations of Capone's empire were unstable. The reliance on bribery created vulnerabilities, as loyalties bought with money could just as easily be sold to rivals or the government. The violence, while effective in the short term, drew increasing attention from law enforcement and reformers, and the very visibility that made Capone a household name also painted a target on his back. The larger his empire grew, the more inevitable it became that the federal government would step in to challenge him. For now, though, Capone stood at the height of his power. His speakeasies kept the city buzzing, his bribes kept the law at bay, and his image as both gangster and benefactor kept him firmly in the public eye. Chicago belonged to him, not through legal authority, but through a combination of charm, cash, and the cold steel of the Tommy gun. The empire was expanding, and Scarface was in control. But as history would soon show, expansion often carries within it the seeds of destruction. The rivalries Capone had ignited, and the blood that stained Chicago's streets were building toward a climax that would shock the world and define his legacy forever. Every legend needs an image, and for Al Capone, that image was both a blessing and a curse. His empire may have been built on bootlegging, bribery, and violence, but what set him apart from countless other gangsters of his era was his ability to turn himself into a recognizable figure, an icon of the Prohibition age. Capone was not content to remain in the shadows like so many criminals before him. He cultivated fame, manipulated the press, and turned his physical scars and larger than life personality into tools of power. In doing so, he became both a symbol of rebellion and the most hunted man in America. The nickname, Scarface, was born long before his rise to power in Chicago. As a teenager in Brooklyn, Capone worked as a bouncer in clubs, where he developed a reputation for toughness. One night, after insulting a young woman, her brother struck Capone across the face with a knife, leaving 3 deep scars that stretched from his left cheek to his jaw. The wounds never fully healed, and the disfigurement earned him the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. Capone despised it, preferring to be called snorky, a slang term of the time meaning stylish or sharp. Yet in the public imagination, Scarface stuck, lending him a mystique of danger and violence. Journalists seized on the nickname, splashing it across headlines and using it as shorthand for everything Capone represented. The scared face symbolized ruthlessness, the underworld, and the brutality of Chicago's gang wars. For Capone, it was a constant reminder of his past, but it also became part of his brand. He may have hated the moniker, but he understood its power. In a world where image was as important as reality, the scar told a story that no amount of denial could erase. Yet Capone was more than just his scars. He carefully crafted his public persona to appear both intimidating and approachable. He dressed immaculately in tailored suits, silk ties, and fine hats. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and he often wore diamond rings and expensive watches. To see him in public was to see a man who looked less like a thug and more like a wealthy businessman. He carried himself with confidence, smiling easily for photographers and speaking with reporters as though he had nothing to hide. This combination of style and bravado made him a favorite subject for newspapers and magazines. The media attention was not accidental. Capone cultivated relationships with journalists, granting interviews and feeding them quotes that would guarantee headlines. He knew that the more his name appeared in print, the more powerful his image became. In an age when newspapers were the dominant form of mass communication, Capone turned the press into his stage. Some reporters even admitted that they found him charming, a man who spoke candidly and treated them with respect, unlike many politicians who dodged questions. The result was a paradoxical reputation. Capone was both feared for his violence and admired for his charisma. But reputation was not only about charm, it was also about fear. Capone's enemies understood that behind the smile and the sharp suits was a man willing to unleash ruthless violence. The North Side gang learned this firsthand in their bloody war with Capone's syndicate. Drive-by shootings, bombings, and ambushes became part of Chicago's daily reality, and each act of violence added to Capone's legend. Even those who had never met him spoke of him with a mixture of awe and dread. He was the face of organized crime, the man who seemed untouchable, the gangster who turned Chicago into his personal kingdom. Despite his notoriety, Capone was careful to present himself as a businessman rather than a criminal. He described his work not as bootlegging or racketeering, but as providing a service to the people. "I give the public what it wants," he famously declared. In his mind, he was not breaking the law, but meeting a demand that the government had foolishly tried to suppress. This framing allowed him to justify his empire, portraying himself as a provider rather than a predator. To many ordinary Chicagoans who frequented speakeasies or struggled during the Depression, this narrative made sense. Capone became, in their eyes, less of a criminal and more of a Robin Hood figure. Still, the darker aspects of his reputation could not be ignored. Rumors swirled about his involvement in murders, kidnappings, and extortion schemes. Though he was rarely convicted of violent crimes, the sheer number of bodies linked to gang wars under his reign told their own story. The press alternated between glamorizing him as a daring outlaw and condemning him as a ruthless killer. Religious leaders and reformers denounced him as the embodiment of moral decay, while politicians publicly vowed to bring him down. Capone, meanwhile, thrived on the attention, knowing that every article, whether positive or negative, made him more famous. His public image extended into the world of entertainment as well. Songs, plays, and later films drew inspiration from his persona. While not always named directly, characters based on Capone began appearing in popular culture, cementing the archetype of the flashy, violent gangster who lived by his own rules. Hollywood would eventually turn that archetype into a staple of cinema, but during Capone's lifetime, the blurred line between reality and fiction only heightened his notoriety. He was both man and myth, a living story that captured the imagination of America. Capone's identity as Scarface also influenced how law enforcement pursued him. Unlike other gangsters who kept low profiles, Capone's fame made him a constant target. Every newspaper headline, every photograph, every public appearance fueled the determination of federal agents to bring him down. His very visibility, which had helped build his legend, also ensured that he could never truly hide. The scar on his face was more than a mark of violence. It was a beacon that drew attention wherever he went. At the same time, Capone's reputation as a family man added another layer to his image. Despite his violent profession, he maintained close ties to his wife, May, and their only son, Sonny. He was known to be affectionate with his child, taking him to ball games and shielding him from the darker side of his business. Associates often remarked that Capone seemed genuinely devoted to his family, a contradiction that further complicated his public persona. To the world, he was Scarface, the ruthless gangster. To those at home, he was simply Al, the father and husband. This duality, public monster, private man, became central to his legend. It was part of what made him so fascinating to journalists, historians, and the public alike. Few figures embodied contradiction as fully as Capone. He was scarred yet stylish, violent yet charitable, feared yet admired. He was a man who thrived on attention, but also struggled with the weight of his fame. In many ways, his reputation was both his greatest weapon and his ultimate vulnerability. By the late 1920s, Capone's image was firmly etched into the American consciousness. He was no longer just another gangster in Chicago. He was the gangster, the face of an era defined by prohibition, corruption, and violence. His identity as Scarface had transcended his actual deeds, turning him into a symbol of everything glamorous and terrifying about organized crime. But fame has its price, and for Capone, the spotlight that had elevated him would soon illuminate his downfall. By the late 1920s, Chicago had become a city defined by fear. Gunfire rattled through its streets, bombs exploded in its neighborhoods, and headlines carried the names of gangsters as frequently as politicians. At the center of it all stood Al Capone, his empire of bootlegging and vice unrivaled in size and influence. Yet, despite his power, one obstacle refused to yield: the North Side Gang led by George "Bugs" Moran. Their bitter rivalry with Capone's syndicate would culminate in one of the most infamous events in American criminal history, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The roots of this confrontation stretched back years to the days when Dean O'Banion led the North Side Gang. O'Banion had been a florist by trade, but his real business was bootlegging, and his territory in Chicago was as profitable as it was contested. When O'Banion was killed in 1924, allegedly on the orders of Capone and Johnny Torrio, the North Side's thirst for revenge only deepened. Hemingway took control, and after his violent death, George Moran rose to leadership. Each transition did nothing to cool the feud. Instead, it fanned the flames of a war that turned Chicago into a battlefield. Moran was as tough as they came. He despised Capone and publicly mocked him, calling him a wop and ridiculing his attempts to pose as a legitimate businessman. For Capone, these insults were personal. In the underworld, respect was currency, and Moran's defiance was not just an inconvenience. It was a direct challenge to Capone's authority. The North Side gang also continued to hijack Capone's liquor shipments, cutting into his profits and undermining his reputation. The tension built with each passing year, and by 1929, it was clear that only a decisive strike could end the standoff. The plan, as history would record, was as ruthless as it was calculated. On the morning of February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day, 7 members and associates of Moran's gang gathered at the SMC Cartage Company garage on North Clark Street. They were waiting for a shipment of whiskey that was supposed to be delivered. Unbeknownst to them, the setup was a trap. Witnesses would later describe a scene that seemed almost surreal. At approximately 10:30 a.m., 4 men entered the garage. 2 of them were dressed as uniformed police officers, while the others wore plain clothes. In an era when police corruption was rampant and raids were common, the sight of officers storming a suspected gang hangout raised no suspicion. Believing it to be a routine bust, the 7 men inside complied. They were ordered to line up against a brick wall. What happened next became seared into the nation's memory. Instead of arresting them, the imposters opened fire. Thompson's submachine guns, the dreaded Tommy guns of the era, sprayed bullets into the helpless men, cutting them down in a storm of lead. When the shooting stopped, the garage floor was soaked in blood. 6 of the men lay dead, their bodies riddled with bullets. One, Frank Gusenberg, was still clinging to life despite having been hit more than a dozen times. When police arrived, they asked him who had shot him. Gusenberg, true to the gangster's code of silence, replied, "Nobody shot me," before succumbing to his wounds. The victims included Moran's top lieutenants, men critical to the strength of the North Side gang. But Moran himself escaped. By sheer luck, he had been running late that morning. As he approached the garage, he saw the police cars outside and assumed it was a raid. He turned back, unknowingly saving his life. The massacre, meant to eliminate Moran along with his crew, fell short of its ultimate goal, but its impact reverberated far beyond Chicago. News of the killing spread rapidly. Photographs of the crime scene, showing the bullet-riddled bodies slumped against the wall, shocked the public. Newspapers across the country carried graphic images and detailed reports, painting a picture of lawlessness that made Chicago look less like a modern American city and more like a war zone. The press dubbed it the same, Valentine's Day Massacre, and it became a symbol of the unchecked violence of Prohibition. Though Capone was not present at the garage that morning, he had carefully established an alibi by staying at his mansion in Florida. Suspicion immediately fell on him. The precision of the attack, the use of disguised gunmen, and the targeting of Moran's men all pointed toward Capone's organization. Authorities tried to connect him to the killings, but as with so many of his alleged crimes, no evidence directly tied him to the scene. Still, in the court of public opinion, Capone was guilty. To many Americans, the massacre was his signature, a demonstration of the lengths he would go to in order to dominate Chicago. The massacre had profound consequences. On the streets, it shattered the power of the North Side gang. Morin's outfit never fully recovered, and Capone's dominance over Chicago's underworld became nearly absolute. Yet the victory came at a price. The brutality of the killings horrified the nation and galvanized public opinion against organized crime. Reformers, politicians, and federal officials who had previously tolerated or ignored Capone's activities now demanded action. The massacre, intended to cement Capone's control, instead marked the beginning of his downfall. The federal government could no longer look the other way. President Herbert Hoover, newly inaugurated, took a personal interest in the case. He ordered federal agencies to intensify their efforts to bring Capone down, using any means necessary. The massacre had made it clear that Chicago's violence was not just a local problem. It was a national embarrassment. If the United States was to uphold the rule of law, Capone had to be stopped. In the years that followed, the Satin, Valentine's Day Massacre became part of American folklore. It embodied the excesses of Prohibition, the corruption of local institutions, and the sheer audacity of gangsters like Capone. The image of 7 men lined against a brick wall, gunned down in cold blood, remained a haunting reminder of what unchecked power could unleash. For Capone, the massacre was both triumph and tragedy. He had crippled his greatest rival, securing his dominance over Chicago's underworld. But he had also drawn more attention than ever before. The spotlight that had once amplified his fame now illuminated his crimes. Law enforcement would tighten its grip, prosecutors would search for weaknesses, and the public's patience would wear thin. Scarface had won the battle for Chicago, but in doing so, he had set in motion the chain of events that would ultimately lead to his fall. On that cold February morning, bullets not only ended the lives of 7 men, they changed the course of American history. The Sting, Valentine's Day Massacre, became the defining moment of Capone's career, the bloody pinnacle of his reign, and the turning point that ensured his empire would not last forever. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929 had left Chicago reeling. The bloodied garage on North Clark Street became a symbol of everything wrong with Prohibition. Unchecked violence, corrupt officials, and criminal empires that seemed more powerful than the government itself. Al Capone, despite his absence from the crime scene, stood accused in the court of public opinion. Newspapers branded him the mastermind, reformers pointed to him as the embodiment of lawlessness, and ordinary citizens demanded action. For years, Capone had thrived under a system of local corruption, bribing police, judges, and politicians. But now, the federal government itself was preparing to intervene. At the highest level of power, President Herbert Hoover made it clear. Capone's reign had to end. Hoover's interest in Capone was more than political posturing. The massacre had embarrassed the United States on the world stage. Foreign journalists reported that Chicago was less a modern metropolis than a gangster kingdom, where bullets ruled and officials cowered. For a nation that prided itself on democracy and law, the image was intolerable. Hoover ordered his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, to get Capone. Those 3 words launched one of the most determined campaigns in federal law enforcement history. But bringing down Capone was no simple task. His empire was vast, his money endless, and his web of bribery nearly impenetrable. Traditional police work had failed repeatedly. Witnesses vanished, jurors were bought, and charges dissolved under mysterious circumstances. To succeed, the government needed new tactics, new weapons, and incorruptible men who could not be swayed by cash or fear. Out of that need emerged a special team. Elliot Ness and the Untouchables. Elliot Ness was a young Prohibition agent in his late 20s when he was chosen to lead the mission against Capone. He was not a seasoned detective or a hardened street fighter. Instead, he was methodical, disciplined, and most importantly, incorruptible. Ness assembled a team of agents who shared his reputation for honesty. Unlike many lawmen of the era, these men refused bribes, resisted intimidation, and focused relentlessly on their goal. It was this incorruptibility that earned them their nickname, the Untouchables. The task of the Untouchables was to strike directly at the heart of Capone's empire, his breweries, distilleries, and distribution networks. While the gangster himself seemed untouchable in court, his organization depended on a steady supply of alcohol to generate profits. Ness and his men launched raids across Chicago, smashing stills, seizing trucks, and arresting gangsters. Each raid was carefully planned, often carried out in secrecy to avoid tip-offs. The losses inflicted on Capone's business were significant, costing him millions and undermining his control. Capone, of course, did not take these assaults lightly. He tried to bribe Ness and his men, offering them fortunes to look the other way. When bribes failed, he turned to intimidation. Death threats poured in, and gangsters stalked Ness's team through the streets of Chicago. Yet the Untouchables refused to bend. They wore their incorruptibility as a badge of honor, and their defiance made them heroes in the eyes of the public. For the first time, Capone faced opponents who could not be bought or scared. While Ness struck at Capone's liquor empire, another front opened in the battle taxes. Capone himself had once joked, "They can't collect legal taxes from illegal money." But that joke would come back to haunt him. Treasury agents, led by Frank J. Wilson of the Intelligence Unit, began scrutinizing Capone's finances. Though Capone lived lavishly, buying mansions, driving luxury cars, and gambling enormous sums, he had never filed a tax return. Wilson's team painstakingly gathered evidence, linking Capone's extravagant lifestyle to his criminal earnings. By interviewing bookkeepers, seizing ledgers, and tracking expenditures, they built a case that would prove Capone had evaded federal income taxes. It was an ingenious strategy. While Capone had evaded charges of murder, racketeering, and bootlegging, tax evasion was different. It was not dependent on frightened witnesses or corrupt judges. It relied on numbers, documents, and the simple fact that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. What began as a financial investigation would become the cornerstone of Capone's eventual downfall. The combined efforts of Ness's Untouchables and Wilson's investigators tightened the noose around Capone. In 1931, federal prosecutors unveiled their case, 22 counts of tax evasion, covering years of unpaid income. The government sought not only to punish Capone, but to make an example of him. For a nation weary of gangster violence, the trial promised justice at last. Capone, confident as ever, initially dismissed the charges. He believed that, as always, his money and influence would save him. He even boasted to reporters that he had struck a deal for a light sentence, claiming he would serve only 2 years in prison. But federal Judge James H. Wilkerson shattered those expectations. Rejecting the plea bargain, Wilkerson declared that Capone would face trial on all charges. It was a stunning blow to the gangster who had grown accustomed to bending the system to his will. As the trial approached, Capone's organization attempted one final play, jury tampering. His men bribed and threatened jurors, ensuring a favorable outcome. But Judge Wilkerson anticipated the move. On the morning of the trial, he switched the jury with one from another courtroom, catching Capone's syndicate off guard. It was a decisive maneuver that stripped Capone of his last advantage. The trial itself became a spectacle. Newspapers across the country covered every detail, from Capone's tailored suits to the testimony of accountants. Prosecutors presented evidence of Capone's wealth, including gambling receipts, hotel bills, and records of extravagant purchases. Witnesses described his operations, linking him to untaxed income. Capone's defense argued that he was merely a businessman, but the numbers told a different story. In the end, the jury found him guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. On October 17, 1931, Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, the harshest penalty ever imposed for tax evasion at the time. He was also fined in $50,000 and charged nearly $8,000 in court costs. For the man who had once ruled Chicago, it was a crushing defeat. The king of the underworld was finally behind bars. The fall of Capone marked a turning point in the battle against organized crime. The government had proven that no gangster, no matter how wealthy or feared, was beyond its reach. Hoover hailed the victory as a triumph of law and order, while Ness and the Untouchables became national heroes. For the public, weary of gang wars and corruption, Capone's conviction was a moment of relief, a sign that justice, though delayed, could still prevail. Yet the story did not end there. Capone's imprisonment would bring new challenges, both for him personally and for the criminal underworld he left behind. The empire he had built began to crumble without his leadership, while rival gangs moved to fill the vacuum. And for Capone himself, prison life would prove far harsher than the streets of Chicago ever had. For now, though, the message was clear: the era of Al Capone's invincibility was over. The Untouchables had lived up to their name, the government had delivered its blow, and the man once called Scarface was no longer the untouchable king of Chicago, but an inmate in the custody of the United States. By the summer of 1931, the walls around Al Capone were closing in. For nearly a decade, he had ruled Chicago as an untouchable figure, his empire built on liquor, gambling, and vice. His enemies had fallen before him, his rivals silenced through bullets or bribery. But now, the United States government had brought charges that even Capone could not laugh away: tax evasion. It was an unexpected angle of attack, one that stripped away the glamour of gang wars and focused instead on cold, unyielding numbers. The stage was set for one of the most sensational trials in American history. Capone entered the Cook County Courthouse in Chicago dressed, as he always was, in tailored suits, with polished shoes, his broad frame radiating confidence. Reporters swarmed him, eager to capture every gesture, every smirk, every word. To the public, the trial was more than a legal proceeding. It was a battle between the most famous gangster in America and the federal government, determined to prove its strength. The eyes of the nation were fixed on courtroom 6-23, where Scarface would finally face justice. The indictment charged Capone with 22 counts of tax evasion covering income from 1924 to 1929. Prosecutors alleged that despite living a life of unimaginable luxury, he had never filed a tax return. They argued that his sprawling empire, though illegal, still generated taxable income. Capone's lawyers scoffed at the charges, insisting that their client was a gambler who lived on luck, not a businessman who kept profits. But the prosecutors had done their homework. Treasury agent Frank J. Wilson and his team had spent years assembling financial evidence, piecing together Capone's wealth through hotel bills, betting slips, and ledgers smuggled out of his operations. Behind the scenes, Capone believed he had already secured his escape. He had boasted to reporters that he had arranged a plea deal that would limit his prison time to 2 years. For a man who had openly mocked the law, 2 years was a small price to pay. But Judge James H. Wilkerson had other ideas. In a move that stunned Capone and his legal team, Wilkerson rejected the plea bargain outright, declaring that no agreements had been made. The gangster who had bribed police, politicians, and even jurors in the past now faced a judge who could not be swayed. As the trial began in October 1931, Capone's men once again attempted to tamper with the jury. Bribes and threats flowed through the city, ensuring that those selected would favor the defense. But Judge Wilkerson anticipated the scheme. On the morning of the trial, in a stroke of cunning, he quietly ordered the entire jury panel replaced with one from another courtroom. The switch blindsided Capone's organization, leaving them powerless to manipulate the outcome. For once, the odds were not in his favor. The prosecution's case unfolded methodically. Witnesses described Capone's operations in detail. Breweries churning out illegal alcohol, gambling houses taking in vast sums, and bookkeepers recording profits in coded ledgers. Hotel clerks testified about his extravagant stays, where he paid in cash for suites that cost thousands. Tailors described the luxury suits he ordered, each one costing more than most men earned in months. Even his personal spending habits, from silk shirts to diamond jewelry, were presented as evidence. The message was clear: Capone lived like a king, but on paper he had no income. The defense tried to counter by portraying Capone as a victim of circumstance. They argued that he was simply a gambler, a man with bad luck who exaggerated his wealth to maintain an image. They tried to discredit witnesses, dismiss the evidence, and appeal to the jury's sense of fairness. But the weight of the numbers was overwhelming. Piece by piece, the prosecution built an image of a man who flaunted his riches while defying the law. Throughout the trial, Capone attempted to maintain his charm. He smiled at reporters, joked with guards, and occasionally patted jurors on the shoulder. He wanted to appear as a likable rogue rather than a ruthless criminal. Yet beneath the bravado, cracks were beginning to show. For the first time, the man who had controlled Chicago with fear and bribery was at the mercy of a system he could not manipulate. After nearly 2 weeks of testimony, closing arguments sealed Capone's fate. Prosecutor George E.Q. Johnson thundered that no man was above the law, not even a gangster as powerful as Capone. He reminded the jury that Capone had grown rich while ordinary Americans struggled through the Great Depression. His crimes were not just financial. They were an insult to the rule of law itself. The jury deliberated for less than 9 hours before returning with their verdict. Capone was found guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. As the words echoed through the courtroom, the once confident gangster sat in silence. The smirk that had defined his public persona was gone. For the first time in his adult life, Capone faced a punishment he could not evade. On October 17, 1931, Judge Wilkerson pronounced the sentence: 11 years in federal prison, a $50,000 fine, and $7,692 in court costs. It was the harshest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion, designed not only to punish Capone, but to send a message to every criminal who thought himself untouchable. Reporters rushed to file their stories, declaring the end of an era. The king of Chicago had been dethroned. The reaction across the nation was immediate. Newspapers hailed the conviction as a victory for justice. Citizens who had grown wary of gangster violence celebrated. To them, Capone's downfall symbolized hope that order could be restored. Law enforcement officials, emboldened by the success, began applying similar tactics against other criminals. If Capone could be brought down by his taxes, no one was safe. For Capone, the sentence was devastating. The empire he had built brick by brick began to crumble without his leadership. His lieutenants scrambled to hold on to power, but rival gangs quickly moved to exploit the vacuum. Chicago, though still plagued by crime, would never again be ruled so completely by a single man. As he was led away in handcuffs, the cameras captured an image that contrasted sharply with the legend. No longer the confident kingpin in silk suits, Capone was now just another prisoner. He would be sent first to Atlanta Penitentiary and later to the most notorious prison in America, Alcatraz. For a man accustomed to luxury, isolation on the Rock would be a slow and painful descent. The trial of Al Capone remains one of the most iconic moments in American legal history. It demonstrated the power of persistence, the ingenuity of prosecutors, and the importance of integrity in law enforcement. More than that, it shattered the myth of invincibility that had surrounded gangsters for so long. Capone had believed himself untouchable. In the end, it was a handful of accountants and a determined judge who proved otherwise. The fall of Scarface was complete. The man who had risen from the streets of Brooklyn to rule Chicago as a criminal kingpin was now nothing more than an inmate. His name would live on in history, but his empire was gone. And for the people of Chicago, long terrorized by his reign, the trial was a turning point. The moment when justice, against all odds, finally prevailed. When the gavel fell in 1931 and Judge Wilkerson sentenced Al Capone to 11 years in federal prison, the mighty king of Chicago's underworld began a journey unlike anything he had faced before. For years, he had lived in luxury. Silk suits, diamond jewelry, champagne flowing in gilded nightclubs. He had bought police officers, controlled politicians, and walked the streets with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. But now, stripped of his empire, Capone was no longer Scarface the Kingpin. He was prisoner number 40886, entering a world where his money and power meant little. His first stop was the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. In 1932, Capone arrived at the prison gates surrounded by guards and reporters, his presence sparking headlines across the nation. To many Americans, it was a moment of poetic justice, seeing the man who had once ruled Chicago reduced to a common inmate. But even behind bars, Capone tried to bend the system to his will. He bribed guards for special privileges, securing a larger cell, fine furniture, and even access to a typewriter. He managed to smuggle in personal comforts, including expensive bedding and food. For a time, it seemed that Capone had simply turned Atlanta into another one of his domains. Yet his influence was not limitless. Unlike local jails in Chicago, Atlanta Penitentiary was run by the federal government, and the scrutiny on Capone was intense. Fellow inmates resented his special treatment, and officials soon cracked down. Rumors spread that Capone continued to run parts of his empire from inside, using smuggled notes and visitors as messengers. The press reported that Scarface was living a life of ease compared to other prisoners, but the truth was more complicated. Capone was struggling with something far more dangerous than rival gangsters or government agents: his own health. Even before his imprisonment, Capone had contracted syphilis, likely in his early years working in brothels. By the time he entered Atlanta, the disease was advancing. Untreated, it began to eat away at his nervous system, causing headaches, fatigue, and moments of confusion. At first, the symptoms were subtle, but over time they grew harder to ignore. The once razor-sharp mind that had orchestrated Chicago's most ruthless operations was beginning to dull. Capone's time in Atlanta was marked by conflict. Other inmates, unimpressed by his reputation, challenged him. One incident reportedly saw Capone attacked with scissors by a fellow prisoner, leaving him shaken. He was no longer feared as the unstoppable Scarface. In the strict, hierarchical world of prison, he was simply another inmate, vulnerable and despised for his attempts to buy special treatment. In 1934, The federal government decided that Atlanta was no longer secure enough to hold men like Capone. That year, a new prison opened, an isolated fortress on a rocky island in San Francisco Bay. Its name would soon strike fear into criminals across America. Alcatraz, designed to house the nation's most dangerous and incorrigible prisoners, Alcatraz was meant to be escape-proof, a place where the most notorious men could be broken by isolation and routine. Al Capone was among the first high-profile inmates transferred there. When Capone arrived at Alcatraz in August 1934, he was stripped of the luxuries he had clung to in Atlanta. Here, bribery was impossible. The guards were specially trained, rotated frequently, and paid well to avoid corruption. The rules were strict. Silence was enforced in many areas. Communication was limited, and privileges were earned only through good behavior. Capone, who had once commanded armies of gangsters, was now just another number, prisoner AZ-85. Life on the Rock was harsh. The cold wind from the bay swept through the cell blocks. The food was plain, and the isolation was crushing. Capone worked menial jobs like laundry duty and cleaning, far removed from the power and wealth he once enjoyed. The gangster who had once controlled Chicago's nightlife now scrubbed prison uniforms under the watchful eyes of guards. The syphilis that plagued him continued its relentless assault. By the mid-1930s, Capone began showing signs of neurosyphilis, memory lapses, sudden mood swings, and difficulty concentrating. Inmates noticed that he often seemed confused, unable to follow conversations or remember details. Some mocked him, others pitied him. The man who had once terrified a city was slowly unraveling. Still, Capone occasionally found ways to adapt. He joined the prison band, playing the banjo in a group of inmates who performed for others during recreation periods. It was a humbling sight. Scarface, once the ruthless king of Chicago, strumming a banjo on a rocky island while guards kept watch. He even earned a reputation among some inmates as cooperative, no longer the swaggering gangster, but a man resigned to his fate. Yet his health continued to decline. By 1938, Capone's mental state had deteriorated so badly that prison doctors noted he had the mentality of a 12-year-old child. The disease had ravaged his once formidable intellect. Reports from the time described him as confused, sometimes wandering aimlessly, sometimes muttering to himself. His body, too, grew weaker, his once imposing frame reduced by years of illness and confinement. Capone served nearly 8 years of his sentence, 4 of them on Alcatraz. In 1939, with his health in severe decline, he was transferred to Terminal Island in California to serve out the remainder of his sentence. By then, he was a shadow of the man who had once ruled Chicago. On November 16, 1939, Al Capone was released on parole, not because he had been reformed, but because he was no longer considered a threat. The gangster who had dominated the Prohibition-era left prison as a broken man. Prison had taken everything from him: his power, his health, his reputation. When he returned to his family estate in Palm Island, Florida, Capone was no longer the infamous Scarface feared by millions. He was a sick, diminished figure, cared for by his wife May, and surrounded by relatives who tried to shield him from the public eye. The empire he had once built lay in ruins. His associates scattered, his rivals long since moved on. The years in Atlanta and Alcatraz had been more than a punishment. They had been a transformation. Capone entered as a feared kingpin and left as a weakened man, stripped of the arrogance and dominance that had defined his life. For the world outside, his imprisonment was a symbol of justice. For Capone himself, it was the slow unraveling of a legend, the inevitable fall of a man who had once believed he was untouchable. When Al Capone walked out of prison in 1939, he was no longer the feared Scarface, who had ruled Chicago with an iron fist. The once mighty gangster who had outwitted rivals, bought politicians, and survived assassination attempts was reduced to a frail man in his early 40s, ravaged by illness and mentally diminished. His years in Atlanta and Alcatraz had not only stripped him of his empire, but also accelerated the effects of neurosyphilis, leaving him confused, forgetful, and dependent on others. Capone's release was not a triumphant return to power, but the beginning of a quiet, tragic decline. He returned to his estate on Palm Island, Florida, a sprawling mansion he had purchased in 1928 at the height of his reign. Nestled among palm trees and overlooking Biscayne Bay, the house was once a symbol of his wealth and arrogance, a retreat where he had hosted lavish parties for celebrities and mobsters alike. Now, it became his prison of a different sort. No longer a center of power, the mansion was a place of seclusion, where Capone's family shielded him from the outside world. May Capone, his loyal wife, became his caretaker. Throughout his rise and fall, May had remained steadfast, enduring public humiliation, threats, and the stigma of being married to America's most infamous gangster. Now, she faced the heartbreaking task of watching her husband's mind deteriorate. Capone's mother, Teresa, and other family members also helped, keeping the household functioning while outsiders speculated about the once feared mob boss's fate. In public, Capone was rarely seen. Neighbors and journalists occasionally caught glimpses of him fishing on his boat, shuffling through the gardens, or sitting on the porch in a bathrobe. The swagger, the tailored suits, and the brash confidence were gone. He appeared overweight, slow-moving, and often vacant, staring into space as if lost in another world. Those who encountered him sometimes remarked that he seemed less like a gangster and more like a child, mentally dulled, harmless, and confused. Inside the mansion, his behavior revealed the full extent of his decline. He often rambled incoherently, repeated himself, or forgot where he was. At times he became paranoid, fearing enemies who no longer existed. He would wander the halls clutching a baseball bat, convinced that rivals were hiding in the shadows. In quieter moments, he retreated into delusions of grandeur, bragging that he was still in control of Chicago or that he had secret plans to reclaim his throne. But these were fantasies of a man whose mind had been irreparably damaged. Capone's family did their best to shield him from exploitation. Reporters and biographers sought interviews, hoping to capture a final glimpse of the once great mobster, but May refused. She understood that exposing her husband's condition would only invite ridicule. Instead, she kept him hidden, insisting that the world remember him as he had been, powerful, feared, and larger than life. The truth, however, could not be concealed forever. Word spread that Scarface was a broken man, his mind reduced to that of a child. Occasionally, his past intruded on his quiet decline. Old associates visited, some out of loyalty, others out of curiosity. They found not the commanding boss they remembered, but a confused, diminished figure who struggled to recognize them. Gangsters who had once bowed before Capone's authority left shaking their heads, realizing that the legend of Scarface was truly over. Despite his condition, the authorities continued to monitor him. Federal agents kept files on Capone, wary that he might attempt to re-enter organized crime. But those fears proved unnecessary. Whatever ambitions he might have once harbored had been erased by disease. Capone's empire was gone, divided among other gangs, and his ability to orchestrate schemes had vanished. He was no longer a threat to anyone, except perhaps to himself. The world outside his mansion had also changed dramatically. The Prohibition era, which had fueled Capone's rise, was long over. The 1930s had given way to the Great Depression, and by the 1940s, the United States was embroiled in World War II. Organized crime had shifted focus, moving into new territories such as labor racketeering, narcotics, and wartime black markets. Younger, sharper figures were rising, leaving Capone a relic of a bygone age. Still, his name carried weight. Even in decline, Scarface remained a symbol of gangsterism. His story continued to fascinate Americans from dime novels to Hollywood films. In many ways, Capone's downfall became part of his legend. The king who had risen too high, only to fall to something as mundane as unpaid taxes and untreated disease. By the mid-1940s, Capone's health had worsened considerably. Neurosyphilis had destroyed large portions of his brain, and he suffered frequent seizures and bouts of psychosis. Doctors described him as having the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. They hired nurses and doctors to care for him, but there was little they could do. Antibiotics like penicillin, which could have treated syphilis, were not widely available until the mid-1940s. Far too late for Capone. In 1946, his doctors and a Baltimore psychiatrist formally declared him mentally incapable of managing his affairs. The once feared gangster, who had controlled a criminal empire worth millions, could no longer make basic decisions about his own life. His family assumed legal control of his estate, ensuring that his final years would be lived in seclusion. Capone's decline reached its final chapter in January 1947. On January 21, he suffered a massive stroke, leaving him partially paralyzed. 4 days later, as his body weakened, he developed pneumonia. Though doctors fought to keep him alive, his health collapsed rapidly. On January 25, 1947, Alphonse Gabriel Capone died at the age of 48. The official cause was cardiac arrest, brought on by the complications of his stroke and pneumonia. News of his death spread quickly. Newspapers across the world announced that Scarface was gone. Some headlines treated him as a villain, a symbol of the violence and corruption of Prohibition. Others painted him as a tragic figure, a man who had risen to extraordinary power only to be destroyed by his own hubris and disease. For Chicago, the city he had once ruled, his death was both an ending and a reminder of a dark chapter in its history. Capone's funeral was a quiet affair compared to the life he had lived. Held in Chicago, it was attended primarily by family members and a few old associates. There were no grand parades, no displays of underworld power. He was buried at Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, in the same cemetery where other members of Chicago's underworld would eventually rest. For all his power, his end was unremarkable. His grave marked simply, overshadowed by the legend of Scarface that would live on in books, films, and folklore. Al Capone's final years were not spent in glory, but in decline, a slow unraveling of body and mind. The man who had once controlled a city with fear, who had built an empire from bootlegging and bloodshed, ended his days in seclusion, confused and dependent, surrounded by family, but far removed from the world he had once dominated. His story, in the end, was not just one of power and violence, but also of fragility. Scarface, the most feared gangster in America, was defeated not by bullets or rivals, but by time, disease, and the weight of his own legacy. Al Capone died in 1947, but in many ways, his story did not end with his burial at Mount Carmel Cemetery. Instead, it grew larger, more complex, and more enduring. Few figures in American history have cast as long a shadow as Scarface. To some, he remains a symbol of ruthless violence, the gangster who bathed Chicago in blood to build an empire. To others, he is remembered as a folk hero, a rebel who thrived by outsmarting a corrupt system during Prohibition. Over time, the man and the myth became inseparable, his true story buried beneath layers of exaggeration, legend, and popular culture. The reality of Capone's life was stark and brutal. He was a mobster who oversaw murder, extortion, and corruption on a massive scale. His empire was built on the suffering of others, from the workers forced into silence to the families shattered by gang violence. Yet the myth of Capone, carefully cultivated during his lifetime and expanded after his death, often painted him in a softer light. Newspapers of the 1920s sometimes described him as a modern-day Robin Hood, a man who provided jobs during the Depression and gave gifts to the poor. Stories circulated of him handing out turkeys on Thanksgiving or donating to local charities. These gestures, while not entirely false, were strategic acts of self-promotion. They were meant to soften his image, to make him appear less like a ruthless kingpin and more like a generous patriarch. Hollywood played a major role in shaping Capone's legacy. Films such as Scarface, 1932, loosely based on his life, presented the gangster as both villain and tragic anti-hero. Audiences were captivated by the drama of his rise and fall, the mix of charm and cruelty that defined him. Over time, Capone became less a historical figure and more an archetype, the ultimate gangster, the embodiment of the criminal underworld. In movies, novels, and television shows, his image was recycled endlessly: the cigar-smoking mob boss in a fedora, speaking in sharp commands, untouchable until the law finally caught up with him. The myth was fueled by America's complicated relationship with crime. During Prohibition, millions of ordinary citizens themselves broke the law by drinking illegally. In that sense, Capone represented something more than organized crime. He symbolized defiance against an unpopular system. People knew he was violent, but they also knew he supplied the alcohol they craved. This blurred moral line allowed his legend to grow. To some, he was not just a criminal, but a businessman who gave the people what they wanted when the government refused. Yet the reality remained darker. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, perhaps the most infamous moment of his career, revealed the true nature of Capone's empire. 7 men lined up against a wall and executed in cold blood. This was not the work of a benevolent outlaw, but of a man determined to rule through fear. Chicago under Capone was a city where murder was a common tool of business, where bribery corrupted every level of government, and where ordinary citizens lived under the constant shadow of gang violence. Capone's legacy is also bound to his downfall, that he was brought down not by bullets or rival gangsters, but by tax evasion remains one of history's great ironies. It reinforced the idea that no one, not even the most feared man in America, was above the law. His conviction became a turning point for federal law enforcement, a lesson in the power of persistence and creative prosecution. In this way, Capone's story became part of a larger narrative, the triumph of law and order over organized crime. Yet even in his defeat, the myth endured. Some admired his audacity, others his ability to thrive in a corrupt system. In Chicago, his name remained etched into the city's identity. Tourists still visit sites associated with him, from the Lexington Hotel, where he kept his headquarters, to the garage on North Clark Street, where the massacre occurred. Restaurants and nightclubs, once frequented by Capone, advertise his connection, blending history with legend to attract visitors. For better or worse, his presence continues to linger. Capone's life also raises questions about the nature of American success. He was, after all, a product of the immigrant experience, a poor boy from Brooklyn who rose to unimaginable wealth and power. In another life, his drive, charisma, and cunning might have made him a legitimate businessman. But in the America of the 1920s, where opportunities were shaped by corruption and inequality, Capone found his path in crime. His story exposes the darker side of the American dream, where ambition unchecked by morality leads not to greatness but to destruction. The contrast between myth and reality is perhaps most visible in the final years of his life. The myth suggests a man who died a legend, remembered forever as Scarface. The reality was far sadder, a broken man, mentally diminished, living in seclusion under the care of his family. The gangster who once commanded armies of killers was reduced to a shadow of himself, unable even to manage his own affairs. That image, the fragile, confused man wandering his Florida estate, is rarely shown in movies or books. It does not fit the myth, and yet it is the truest reflection of the man's fate. Capone's story continues to resonate because it embodies contradictions. He was both feared and admired, ruthless and generous, larger than life, yet tragically human. His rise reflects the opportunities and corruption of Prohibition-era America, while his fall demonstrates the limits of power and the inevitability of justice. His legend has been polished by time, but beneath it lies a grim reality, a life built on crime, ending in disease and decline. In the end, Al Capone's legacy is not just about the man himself, but about what he represents. He is the symbol of an era when crime ruled the streets, when money and violence could buy power, and when the government struggled to assert control. He is also the reminder that no empire, no matter how ruthless, lasts forever. The myth of Scarface will continue to live on in movies, books, and folklore. But the reality of bloodshed, corruption, and eventual decline remains the darker truth behind the legend. When Al Capone was sent to prison in 1931, the newspapers declared that Chicago's underworld had lost its king. But while Scarface's fall marked the end of an era, it did not mean the end of organized crime in the city. In fact, Capone's empire did not crumble, it evolved. Out of the chaos he left behind rose a new generation of mob leaders, smoother, quieter, and far more strategic than the flamboyant Scarface. The Chicago outfit, as it came to be known, would not only survive Capone's downfall, but thrive for decades, embedding itself so deeply into the city's fabric that its influence stretched far beyond bootlegging and racketeering. The man who first stepped into Capone's shoes was Frank Nitti, a longtime lieutenant known as the Enforcer. Nitti lacked Capone's charisma and public persona, but he possessed a sharp mind for business and a talent for staying out of the limelight. Under his leadership, the outfit shifted its focus away from bootlegging, which had collapsed with the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, and moved into other rackets: labor unions, gambling, loan sharking, and extortion. The repeal had destroyed the black market alcohol trade, but it opened new opportunities for organized crime to adapt and expand. Nitti's genius was in understanding that brute force could only take the mob so far. Where Capone had relied on guns and intimidation, Nitti embraced corruption and infiltration. The outfit tightened its grip on Chicago's labor unions, particularly those in the construction, trucking, and entertainment industries. By controlling unions, the mob could extract money from employers, influence city contracts, and even manipulate strikes to its advantage. This shift allowed the outfit to operate with less public violence, avoiding the kind of bloodshed that had made Capone infamous. Yet Nitti himself would not last. In 1943, facing federal indictments for extorting Hollywood movie studios, he took his own life, shooting himself in a Chicago rail yard. His death opened the door for new leaders, and with them, a new chapter in organized crime. The outfit's next significant boss was Tony Accardo, nicknamed Joe Batters for his brutal efficiency with a baseball bat during his early enforcer days. Accardo was everything Capone was not: quiet, cautious, and disciplined. Where Scarface had flaunted his wealth and invited attention, Ricardo preferred the shadows. He avoided the press, lived modestly, and ruled with a steady hand. Under his leadership, the outfit expanded nationally, investing in casinos in Las Vegas and Havana, while continuing to dominate gambling and loan sharking in Chicago. Ricardo's reign was marked by stability. He understood the value of keeping violence low and profits high. By carefully managing his men and forging alliances, he turned the outfit into one of the most enduring crime syndicates in America. Unlike Capone, who had become a target of relentless publicity, Ricardo cultivated the art of invisibility. He once remarked, "I never killed nobody that didn't deserve it," a chilling reminder of his ruthlessness hidden beneath a calm exterior. During the mid-20th century, the outfit became deeply entwined with the national mafia network, often referred to as the Commission. While New York's five families dominated headlines, Chicago remained equally powerful, its influence stretching across the Midwest and into Nevada. The outfit's control over Teamsters' union pension funds provided them with an endless pool of cash, which they used to bankroll casino projects in Las Vegas. Skimming profits from casinos became one of the mob's most lucrative ventures, with millions disappearing before the money could be reported to the government. Perhaps the most notorious link between the outfit and national politics came through Jimmy Hoffa, the powerful Teamsters boss. Hoffa's ties to Chicago mobsters ensured union protection, but also dragged him deeper into the criminal underworld. Through Hoffa, the outfit had access to billions of dollars in pension funds, money that was often funneled into mob-controlled businesses. When Hoffa disappeared in 1975, many suspected that the outfit had played a role, though the mystery was never solved. Despite their success, the outfit could never fully escape scrutiny. Federal investigations in the 1950s and 1960s exposed the extent of mob infiltration into unions and businesses. The televised Kefauver hearings of 1950-51 shocked the nation by revealing organized crime's reach into American life. Chicago mobsters, though often elusive, were recognized as key players in this national network. Yet even under pressure, the outfit endured, adapting to each new threat. By the 1970s, leadership had passed from Ricardo to Sam Giancana, a flashy figure more reminiscent of Capone. Giancana loved the limelight, mingling with celebrities like Frank Sinatra and reportedly maintaining ties to the CIA during covert operations against Fidel Castro. But his flamboyance proved dangerous. His reign drew unwanted attention from law enforcement and rival mobsters alike. In 1975, Giancana was assassinated in his Chicago home, silenced before he could testify to a federal grand jury. The outfit's ability to survive leadership changes was a testament to its structure. Unlike Capone's empire, which had revolved around a single dominant personality, the post-Capone outfit functioned as a collective, with power distributed among a board of trusted lieutenants. This system made it harder for law enforcement to bring down the organization in one sweep. Leaders came and went, but the machine kept running. As the decades passed, the outfit diversified further, venturing into drug trafficking, pornography, and international money laundering. But they never lost their grip on Chicago. Neighborhoods, businesses, and even city politics bore their imprint. Some politicians owed their careers to mob support, while others lived in fear of it. The outfit was no longer the noisy, bloody empire of Scarface. It had become something more dangerous, an invisible hand shaping the city from the shadows. By the late 20th century, however, the outfit faced new challenges. The federal government had developed more sophisticated tools, such as the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RACAO, which allowed prosecutors to dismantle entire criminal enterprises rather than just individual figures. Wiretaps, undercover operations, and witness protection programs gave law enforcement the upper hand. Slowly, piece by piece, the outfit's empire was chipped away. Yet even in decline, the outfit never disappeared. Into the 21st century, investigators continued to uncover evidence of its presence in Chicago, from illegal gambling operations to political corruption scandals. Its power had diminished compared to its mid-century peak, but the legacy remained. Chicago was still the city Capone had once ruled, and his successors had ensured that the underworld endured long after his death. Looking back, the transition from Capone to the outfit reveals a profound shift in organized crime. Capone embodied the violent, flamboyant gangster of the Prohibition era. Loud, feared, and always in the public eye. His successors embraced a quieter, more calculated model, one based on corruption, business acumen, and longevity. Where Capone had burned brightly and briefly, the outfit endured for nearly a century. In many ways, this evolution was the ultimate legacy of Scarface. His empire showed both the potential and the dangers of centralized power. His downfall taught his successors to avoid the spotlight, to hide behind legitimate businesses and political connections. They learned from his mistakes and built an organization that outlived him by generations. The Chicago outfit remains one of the most infamous crime syndicates in American history. It is the child of Capone's empire, refined and reshaped by those who came after him. And while Scarface himself may have ended in decline, the organization he built ensured that his shadow stretched far beyond his own lifetime, haunting Chicago long after his death. Al Capone may have died in 1947, but in the decades that followed, his name only grew louder. If his criminal empire had been built with bullets and bootleg liquor, his legend was built with typewriters, cameras, and microphones. In literature, cinema, television, and even music, Scarface became more than a man. He became an enduring cultural icon. To this day, few criminals are as recognizable as Al Capone, his name synonymous with the gangster archetype. But how did this transformation happen? How did a violent bootlegger become one of the most famous figures in American culture? It began during his lifetime. Even in the 1920s, newspapers could not resist Capone's story. He was tailor-made for headlines, the immigrant son who rose from the Brooklyn slums to rule Chicago. The gangster who dressed in silk suits while ordering massacres, the man who both terrified and fascinated the public. The press gave him nicknames: Scarface, the big fella, public enemy number one, and in doing so, they created a brand. Capone understood this and played along. He gave interviews, posed for photographs, and cultivated the image of a powerful yet charming outlaw. In many ways, he was the first modern celebrity criminal. After his downfall and death, that legend only expanded. Hollywood quickly realized that Capone's story was cinematic gold. In 1932, just a year after his conviction, Howard Hawks released Scarface. The Shame of the Nation, a thinly veiled dramatization of Capone's rise and fall. Starring Paul Muni as a ruthless gangster modeled after Scarface, the film shocked audiences with its violence and its depiction of organized crime. The censors forced Hawks to add an anti-crime message at the end, but the damage was done. Capone had been immortalized on screen. The movie cemented the image of the gangster as both villain and tragic anti-hero, a template that filmmakers would use for generations. Throughout the 20th century, Capone appeared again and again in films and television. Sometimes he was portrayed directly, as in the 1959 movie Al Capone starring Rod Steiger or Robert De Niro's chilling performance in The Untouchables in 1987. Other times, His life served as inspiration for fictional gangsters, from Tony Cammont in Scarface 1932 to Tony Montana in the 1983 remake. Each version reshaped his image, blending fact and fiction until the line between the real Capone and the cinematic Capone nearly disappeared. On television, Capone became a staple of crime dramas. The long-running series The Untouchables, 1959-1963, starring Robert Stack as Elliot Ness, turned the battle between Capone and law enforcement into weekly entertainment. Later documentaries, dramatizations, and miniseries kept his story alive, each adding new layers to the myth. By the time HBO released Boardwalk Empire in 2010, where Capone appeared as a recurring character, Scarface was no longer just history. He was a cultural symbol that spanned nearly a century of storytelling. Books also played a crucial role in shaping Capone's cultural impact. Biographies, exposés, and novels retold his story from every angle. Some emphasized his brutality, painting him as a ruthless murderer. Others romanticized him, highlighting his charisma and the supposed generosity he showed to Chicago's poor. Writers often used him as a symbol of the Prohibition era, a man who embodied both the corruption of the system and the consequences of defying it. To this day, new books about Capone continue to appear, each promising to reveal the real Scarface, though the truth often remains elusive. But perhaps the most surprising influence of Capone has been in music. From the jazz age to hip-hop, his name has echoed through lyrics as a metaphor for power, defiance, and notoriety. In the 1930s and 1940s, swing and jazz musicians sometimes referenced Capone as part of the lore of Chicago nightlife. Decades later, in the rise of gangster rap, his name became a badge of honor. Artists from Nas to Jay-Z, from Tupac Shakur to Rick Ross, invoked Capone in their lyrics, using him as shorthand for dominance and outlaw success. The connection was clear. Just as Capone had risen from the streets to command an empire, rappers used his image to reflect their own struggles and ambitions. Even outside hip-hop, Capone's name has appeared in punk, rock, and electronic music. Bands adopted his image on album covers, DJs sampled speeches and old radio clips about him, and musicians around the world borrowed his legend to give their art a sense of danger and rebellion. Scarface, the gangster, had transformed into Scarface, the cultural metaphor. The persistence of Capone in art and entertainment raises deeper questions about society's fascination with criminals. Why does a man responsible for so much bloodshed continue to capture the imagination? Part of the answer lies in the duality of his story. Capone represents both the dangers of unchecked ambition and the allure of success against the odds. He was the immigrant outsider who conquered a city, the poor boy who became a millionaire, the rebel who defied the law. For artists and audiences alike, that contradiction is irresistible. It is also worth noting that Capone's myth has often been sanitized. Movies and books rarely dwell on the suffering of his victims or the fear that gripped Chicago. Instead, they highlight his charisma, his business acumen, or his flamboyant lifestyle. In doing so, popular culture has transformed a ruthless criminal into a larger-than-life anti-hero. This romanticization reveals much about the way societies tell stories. We prefer legends over reality, drama over cold truth. Capone's cultural impact also extends beyond entertainment into tourism and commerce. In Chicago, his name is everywhere, on T-shirts, souvenirs, bars, and tours. Companies sell Capone's pizza or Scarface beer. Tourists flock to see sites associated with him, from the Lexington Hotel to the Massacre garage. His image has become a marketing tool, detached from the violence it once represented. In this sense, Capone has been commodified, turned into a brand as recognizable as Coca-Cola or McDonald's. Yet for all the movies, songs, and souvenirs, there remains an unease about Capone's legacy. Scholars and critics often warn against glorifying him, reminding us that behind the myth was a man who thrived on fear and bloodshed. Still, it seems that Scarface's grip on culture is unbreakable. The legend is too powerful, too deeply woven into the fabric of American storytelling. In the end, Al Capone's cultural impact is as complex as the man himself. He was a real gangster whose crimes scarred a city, but he was also a myth created by newspapers, filmmakers, and musicians. That myth has outlived the man, growing larger with each retelling. Today, whether on screen, in a song, or on a souvenir mug, Capone's name carries weight. It reminds us of a time when gangsters ruled the streets, but also of our own fascination with power, rebellion, and the thin line between hero and villain. Crime has been a part of human history as long as societies have existed. From the dusty roads of the 1700s, where bandits preyed on travelers, to the digital age of the 2020s, where cybercriminals steal billions with a keystroke, our fascination with outlaws has never faded. Al Capone's story may have dominated the Prohibition era, but he was only one chapter in a much longer narrative. The tale of how criminals capture our imagination, reflecting both the darkest corners of society and the timeless appeal of rebellion. In the 1700s, before cities like Chicago were even established, figures such as highwaymen in Europe or pirates on the high seas were the outlaws of their age. Men like Blackbeard, the infamous pirate, were feared for their brutality but admired for their daring. Just as Capone would later thrive by exploiting prohibition, these early criminals capitalized on lawless frontiers, whether on the oceans or the countryside. Tales of their exploits spread through ballads and pamphlets, romanticizing men who, in reality, were killers and thieves. The legend of the outlaw, larger than life and often cloaked in charisma, had already begun. As America grew in the 1800s, new kinds of criminals emerged. The frontier produced bandits like Jesse James and Billy the Kid, figures who, much like Capone, became legends in their own lifetimes. Newspapers of the era sensationalized their crimes, turning bank robberies and train hastes into thrilling adventures. Jesse James was sometimes portrayed as a modern Robin Hood, though in truth he was motivated by greed and vengeance. This theme would repeat itself with Capone, society's willingness to blur the line between criminal and folk hero. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, cities became the new frontiers of crime. Industrialization, immigration, and political corruption created fertile ground for organized gangs. In New York, the Five Points neighborhood became notorious for its street gangs. In Chicago, the seeds of organized crime were already planted long before Capone arrived. Figures like Johnny Torrio, Capone's mentor, laid the groundwork for empires built on vice, gambling, and eventually alcohol. These urban criminals were not romanticized cowboys, but businessmen of the underworld, adapting crime to the demands of modern society. Then came Prohibition in the 1920s, a turning point in American criminal history. With the stroke of a pen, the government outlawed alcohol, creating a black market worth billions. Men like Al Capone seized the opportunity, building vast empires that dwarfed the petty crimes of earlier outlaws. The gangster era was born, fueled by machine guns, bootleg liquor, and bribed officials. Capone's reign in Chicago represented the peak of this age, where criminals were not just outlaws, but rulers of cities. But the fascination did not end with Prohibition. After Capone's fall, organized crime evolved into a national network. The mid-20th century saw the rise of the American mafia, stretching from New York to Las Vegas. Figures like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Sam Giancana carried the torch, operating from the shadows while shaping politics, business, and even international affairs. Their power was immense, but once again, the public was captivated. Books, films, and headlines turned mobsters into household names. By the 1970s and 1980s, new types of criminals captured attention. Serial killers like Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and later Jeffrey Dahmer horrified the nation. Unlike the gangsters of the past, these men did not seek power or wealth. They sought control, dominance, and perverse gratification. Yet even their gruesome crimes fed public fascination. Documentaries, books, and eventually television series dissected their psychology, transforming them into figures of dark curiosity. Crime, it seemed, had endless forms, each reflecting the anxieties of its era. The late 20th century also introduced another wave of outlaws, drug lords. Pablo Escobar in Colombia, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman in Mexico, and countless others built empires rivaling Capone's, but on a global scale. Escobar, like Capone, presented himself as a man of the people, building homes for the poor while flooding cities with cocaine. He too became both feared and idolized, his image immortalized in television dramas and rap lyrics. The parallels to Capone were unmistakable: violence mixed with charisma, crime cloaked in a myth of rebellion. As the world entered the 21st century, crime adapted once more. Technology opened new frontiers. Cybercriminals replaced bootleggers, hacking into banks, corporations, and governments. They stole billions without firing a shot, proving that the future of crime was not in the streets, but in cyberspace. Yet even these faceless criminals began to capture public imagination. Movies and series portrayed hackers as modern rebels, fighting systems with code instead of guns. The myth of the outlaw, updated for the digital age, remained intact. And in the 2020s, the fascination has only deepened. Streaming platforms overflow with true crime documentaries, each dissecting the lives of serial killers, gangsters, fraudsters, and cult leaders. Podcasts retell the darkest stories of human behavior, drawing millions of listeners. Social media, too, has become a stage for criminal legend making. Sometimes, individuals involved in crime even gain celebrity status, their stories shared, debated, and romanticized by audiences worldwide. Why does this fascination endure? Perhaps because crime, at its core, is a mirror of society. Criminals reflect our fears, our desires, and our struggles with authority. Al Capone thrived because Prohibition revealed the tension between law and public demand. Escobar thrived because global hunger for drugs created opportunity. Cybercriminals thrive because our dependence on technology exposes vulnerabilities. Each era produces its own Scarface, shaped by the pressures and weaknesses of its time. But fascination also endures because criminals embody rebellion. They break the rules, defy authority, and live outside the boundaries most people cannot cross. Whether feared or admired, they provoke a sense of awe. Their lives often end in violence or tragedy, yet their legends live on. Society condemns them, but culture immortalizes them. Al Capone remains central to this story. He was not the first criminal to become a legend, nor the last, but he epitomized the transformation of crime into myth. From the 1700s highwayman to the 2020s hacker, every outlaw carries a piece of his legacy, the blending of fear, admiration, and fascination. His story reminds us that crime is never just about law breaking. It is about power, identity, and the stories we tell ourselves about those who dare to defy the system. And so, as we look back across centuries of crime, from pirates and bandits to gangsters and cybercriminals, we see a pattern. The names change, the methods evolve, but the fascination remains. Al Capone may have died in 1947, but in the larger story of outlaws, he stands as a bridge between the old world of brute force and the modern world of myth-making. His empire has vanished, but his legend endures, echoing across history as proof that society will always be drawn to those who live and die outside the law.